Leo Garcia Venegas and George Retes were simply trying to work when they got ensnared by dragnet federal immigration raids. Even though both men identified themselves as U.S. citizens, multiple agents aggressively detained them. In Leo's case, 2 separate times, and in George's case for 3 days. Now, as more citizens get swept up in these raids, Leo and George are standing up for their rights with IJ. I'm Kim Norberg of the Institute for Justice, joined by co-host Keith Neely. We're here with IJ attorneys Jared McClain and Jaba Tsitsuashvili to discuss how current immigration raids are enabling warrantless government trespassing, arrests without probable cause, and other abuses of the Constitution. To be clear, these cases aren't about whether the government can enforce immigration laws. They're about whether or not the government has to follow the Constitution, federal law, and its own regulations when it does. This is Beyond the Brief. So, Jared, tell us about Leo's case.
Yeah, so Leonardo Garcia Venegas is a construction worker. He lives in Baldwin County, Alabama, which is just above the Florida Panhandle. He's been working in construction there since he graduated from high school. He's an American citizen. He was born in Florida, moved to Alabama when he was 14, and earlier this year when the administration ramped up its immigration efforts, one of the things they did was create task forces in certain parts of the country with lots of different federal agencies, and one of those places that the task forces are operating is southern Alabama, and they are targeting construction sites, and particularly people on construction sites who they think look like undocumented immigrants. They don't know who's going to be on the site. They don't know who these people are beforehand. They go onto these construction sites and they assume everyone who's there who looks a certain way must be undocumented, and they round them up, they put them in zip ties, and ask questions at some later point in time. Sometimes it takes 10 minutes, sometimes it takes a couple hours, sometimes people are detained for days. And so Leo was going to work in May of 2025, and he showed up to a construction site. His job is to help lay the concrete foundations for new homes. And he's on a team of 5 people. They're out there working. It starts to drizzle. Leo goes to his car to get some plastic to cover up and protect the concrete from the rain. And when he's walking back, he sees 5 guys in camouflage. Some of them are masked. They're armed. They're running past the site's no trespassing sign. They're jumping the little fence. And they go right past all of the white and the black workers who are there, and they go straight for all the Latino workers. A couple of them run. Some officers chase. One of the workers there doesn't run. He's just standing on the concrete. He says, "Why are you here? Do you have a warrant?" They grab him by the arm, throw him to the ground, and Leo takes out his phone and starts recording. He starts walking toward the scene, and as he gets closer, another agent sort of comes along from the side and tries to cut off Leo's path. He's still about 30, 35 feet away, and Leo starts trying to get around the officer so he can keep recording, and the guy was like, "You're making this harder than you have to." And there's no questions, there's no verbal commands, and this guy, masked, camouflage, gun out, just goes toward Leo, starts shortening the distance between him and Leo, and grabs him by the arm, starts pulling him to the ground. Another officer comes, runs over, and Leo's yelling, "Stop, stop, I'm a citizen. I'll show you my papers. I'll show you my papers now. Stop, I'm a citizen." They get him to the ground. A third officer comes over. There's 3 officers holding him down.
Yeah, dude. He's not even doing nothing wrong. It takes, what the He's a citizen, bro.
They go through his pockets. They take out his ID. He has an Alabama-issued real ID in his pocket, and it's got a little star in the corner, as all real IDs do, and that means that the federal government has certified that the person who got that ID has put forward all of the documentation that they needed to prove that they're either a citizen or otherwise have lawful status in the country. The 3 immigration officers look at Leo's ID and they tell him this is fake. And they put him in handcuffs, they pull him up and they lead him off the site and they hold him by their unmarked car out in the road for about an hour. And the whole time Leo's saying, I'm a citizen, I have my documents, like, I have a social security number. And eventually after an hour, one of the officers relented, called in his social security number, and they just uncuffed him and let him go. Leo took about 10, 12 days off work, and just because he was so shaken by this, and
Sure.
And he sees in like the Facebook groups and in his community the stuff's happening all the time. They know where the staging areas are. They know that these raids are happening, and so he's scared that if he's going to go back to work, it's going to happen again. And so he goes back, and the second week of June, he goes back to work, and it happens again. This time, Leo is inside of a house that is basically completely finished. It doesn't have its brick siding, and it doesn't have a garage door. But basically, other than that, you look at it, you see a house. Leo's working inside in a back bedroom. He's the only worker from his crew there that day because he's just like finishing up he's like screwing in, doing some sheetrock work or something, and the rest of his crew's at another site. So he's got an unmarked white pickup truck sitting out in front of this house that he's working in. He's the only guy there, and there is a roving patrol of immigration officers going through this new development that day, and 2 of them walked by and saw Leo through the window, and they just walked right into this house, no warrant, and like Leo had headphones in. He felt someone's presence behind him. He turns around and he says immigration. And the guy starts talking to him in Spanish. He's like, yeah, you need to come out of the house right now. And Leo's like, again, he tells him, I'm a citizen. I have my papers. He's already been through this before. He knows the song and dance by now. And the guy's like, no, you need to come out onto the back patio. Leo turns around and there's another officer standing at the window. And so he's got one at the door, one at the window. There's nowhere for him to go. He's trapped. He goes outside with these guys. He hands him his ID, and they tell him there's no way we can know whether or not this is real. You need to come with us. And they lead him about, 2 city blocks out of this development, and they have their unmarked cars waiting because they stopped driving their cars into the developments because they don't want anyone to see them coming. And there's just like guys coming, immigration officers coming from other parts in the development who there's other crews out there doing roofing or siding or plumbing, and they're just pulling all the Latinos off the site and they're bringing them to this checkpoint and they're checking their IDs. Leo's there about 20 minutes. This time they use an electronic device to scan his ID and confirm his citizenship and then let him go. And let him go along with another guy who was a citizen and another guy who was a legal permanent resident who was there. And they just go back to work. And like that's just has become part of their everyday life is, when am I going to have to go through another one of these raids? And the question always becomes, how long is it going to last? How much violence is going to be involved? Am I going to be taken off the job for 30 minutes, for an hour, for a day? And yeah, so that is Leo Garcia.
Jeez. I mean, there's so many problems there that it's kind of difficult to figure out where to start.
That's
but,
right.
From the very beginning of this, right, they need a warrant, these officers, to go onto this private property, right? And so what's the process for them to get a warrant like that? Like, what should be happening?
Yeah. So typically the way this has happened in the past is they will know that there's one particular business. They get a tip. They find out that someone might be employing undocumented workers. They do a little bit of an investigation. They go to a judge like any other police officer would and say, I have probable cause to believe that this business is employing undocumented people. They maybe have some names or some descriptions of who those people are before they go because they've done an investigation to figure it out beforehand. And one thing that this administration has done is do away with that initial investigation. It used to be the case that if you wanted to go on an immigration raid, you had to go to your superior and fill out a form and say, these are the people who we think are undocumented or have overstayed their visa or whatever, and this is where we think they're going to be. This is who we're going and looking for that day. They have just gotten rid of that form. And what former officials have said is there's no point in having the form anymore because at this point they don't know who they're looking for. They're just going out and profiling. And so you can't go to a judge and just say, hey, we think there might be some Latino construction workers on this site. Give me a warrant.
Right.
And so they're doing away with the warrant process, and they're effectively treating certain businesses as if they are open to the public, because ICE is allowed, any police officer is allowed to go to any publicly accessible area. Like if a member of the public can go, then a police officer can go. But they are just sort of over-expanding that definition of what counts as publicly accessible so that they can...
I mean, a no trespassing sign feels pretty clear to me.
Right. A no trespassing sign, there's fencing up, there's heavy machinery, there's like men at work. This is not an area where a member of the public would feel like they had a right to just walk on and start looking about and stopping people from their work and asking questions. And if they did, the people on the property would have the right to tell them to leave.
Sure.
And it's that right to exclude that implicates the property rights of not just the owner of the property, but all of the people who are working there, who are having they're in control of the property. They're there on a contract to do work, and they have a right to tell the members of the public who, like, if a neighbor just walks on when he's pouring concrete and tries to step, Leo would be able to say, hey, you're not allowed to be here.
Right.
You need to go away.
Were the officers identifying themselves at any point during this? Because in your telling of the first raid, it sounds like they didn't. It sounds like they came on masked up, camoed with weapons, which I would imagine would be pretty intimidating if you saw armed strangers coming onto a construction site where you're working. It sounds like maybe the second time after they confronted him, they might have said immigration or...
Yeah, so... But I believe both times Leo asked and they answered.
I see.
But they didn't come on like...
They didn't affirmatively identify themselves.
Right. And the regulations say that they need to say that they are there doing immigration enforcement as soon as practicable. And when they're not wearing any sort of identification and they have their face covered, like, I think maybe the easiest way for them to identify themselves would just be to wear it on their chest like all other law enforcement officers do. But yeah, so in both times Leo said immigration and they said yes, immigration. So like, yeah, this isn't one of those cases. They eventually
identified themselves, but they didn't make it easy.
Right, and this isn't one of those cases that all these videos are going around. Some of the lack of identification has been much worse in other cases, but still, it's just like terrifying to have like plainclothes officers running onto private property with no warrant and tackling you to the ground without identifying themselves.
And speaking of the video, the other kind of alarming thing that appeared to happen at the first raid is that the officers really didn't come after Leo until he started recording them. And then that starts looking like a whole different set of First Amendment problems. What's going on with that?
Yeah. It's very difficult to parse because you don't know what's in these officers' mind. Like when we asked Leo that question, we said, do you think that you were arrested just for recording, or do you think it was because you were Latino like all the other guys he arrested? And he said he thought he would be arrested anyway. And I think that that's probably confirmed by the fact that once they checked his social security number, they let him go. Rather than some of these other cases that we've been seeing with the First Amendment violations where they're arresting people for like obstruction or endangering an officer by recording them, which is, you're right, it's a completely different constitutional violation, but it is also a constitutional violation.
Right.
So these officers are on the property, they're there, illegally, but even if they had gotten a warrant, how are they supposed to go about the sort of like checking identification of people? It sounds like he shows them his ID kind of right away. They assume that it's fake immediately, and then they just kind of do nothing with it for a while. And then all of a sudden they have this like magic machine that says, yeah, the ID is fine easily. Like, couldn't they have just right away gotten his ID, scanned it, let him go? This is an interaction that takes 90 seconds. Like, is that okay? And could they have done that?
Yeah, so there's actually two steps there. The first is whether they can stop you and make you hand over your ID in the first place, and then the second is how long should that be taking and what's reasonable.
Sure.
And the first part of that is even if they have a right to be on the property, whether it is publicly accessible or they did get a warrant, if you're not the person who is identified in that warrant or they have no idea who you are, they need to have particularized suspicion. And that's just a fancy word that the court has come up with to say they need to have a reason to believe that you specifically have violated the law. And that's where the government is using a general demographic profile rather than identifying people ahead of time. So the stop itself should not be happening, even if they are going onto the property. But then once they're there, to your point, a real ID is authorized by the Department of Homeland Security as being proof of lawful status. And just by looking at it, if the name, if it's a valid current ID and the picture matches, that should be the end of the interaction. I don't even think they need to be taking out their fancy contraptions and scanning them. But if they did and it's taking an extra 15 seconds, 30 seconds, that's not intrusive enough to probably be constitutional and reasonable unless they're then doing something with that data afterward. But yeah, like if you go to a bar or you're buying alcohol at the grocery store, they scan your ID and it takes a half a second to figure out if your ID is real. And so the idea that the very agency who's responsible for authorizing these IDs can't tell whether or not they're real in less than a half hour or an hour is pretty absurd.
How common is this, that citizens are being arrested or detained by immigration enforcement?
Sadly, too common. Just in our case, in Leo's case, we recently filed a motion for class certification and a motion for a preliminary injunction, which seeks to kind of halt these unconstitutional acts immediately because people like Leo are scared to go to work. And just in our case alone, we have 3 declarants who have basically said, very similar things happen to me. We have individuals at construction sites or similar work sites that get raided by masked federal agents. They have no idea who they're going, they have no idea who's there, and what they do in each instance is, like Jared said, they based on this kind of demographic profile, which basically just means everybody who looks Latino, they round them up. They preemptively detain them, handcuff them without asking any questions. And then when they're presented with real IDs or other documentation of lawful presence, including, one of our declarants had a real ID, one had a green card, one had proof of lawful presence, all of them were nevertheless kept detained, kept handcuffed. And so this is, like Leo's case, is a symptom of a federal kind of law enforcement apparatus that's been told, stop doing police work, just go do dragnet enforcement and go round up anybody that you see that fits this profile. Basically, it's an arrest first, ask questions later policy, and it's really disturbing. And ProPublica recently put out a piece that said they found at least 170 American citizens who have so far, and this was already like a month ago. At that point, they found already at least 170 American citizens who've been detained in these raids, be it for half an hour, a day, 3 days, sometimes even longer. And I think in the course of that reporting, I think they had to, at a certain point, kind of just like stop counting and put the piece out, right? Because
it was basically before the Midway Blitz in Chicago. So that's been like half of what has happened so far is not even counted in their count.
Yeah. So basically, this is something that is a matter of kind of law enforcement kind of run amok. And to Jared's point earlier, they've been told, don't bother with these forms that tell you who you're going after beforehand. Go round people up. Do some fishing expeditions. Hopefully, you'll catch some folks who aren't undocumented, and then you'll just release everybody else. But that's not the way that the Fourth Amendment works. The whole idea is that you're supposed to do your investigation before the fact. You're supposed to know who you're targeting beforehand. There's no kind of like immigration exception to the Fourth Amendment and to the way that policing constitutionally has to function in this country.
Yeah. And on the ProPublica piece, like they did like yeoman's work, like verifying these, but they're going only off of lawsuits and like news reports. So if there's not a video recording of these arrests of citizens, most of these are just never seeing the light of day. And we know that that's true because in Leo's case, that's the second arrest, there were 2 other people who were released and let go, and there's no record of it. The government says they're not keeping a record. These people are not coming forward because they're scared to come forward, or they don't know that there's anything that they can do about it. And in one of our declarants case, there were 3 people there who had lawful status who were taken off that job site and never came back. We had a declarant from Florida. There was another person taken off her job site who had legal status who was taken away and never came back. And so, like, this is not to mention our declarants themselves are not in news stories. So it is very hard to get people to come forward because everyone is scared. And there have been 3 articles now on the construction industry, 2 of them focused on Alabama, saying, with people like industry leaders saying, our citizen and legal permanent resident employees are too scared to come to work because they think that this could happen to them. And so, like, then to additionally have these people come forward and stick their neck out and put their name on it and talk to the press or file a lawsuit, there's just not a lot of people who are willing to take that step.
Did you know IJ represents ordinary people, free of charge, as they fight back against government abuse? If you're looking for a rewarding way to support our work, consider becoming a member of our merry band of monthly donors and stand shoulder to shoulder with IJ's clients every month of the year. Monthly donations are convenient and cost-efficient, meaning more of your money goes directly to our fight for freedom and justice. Sign up to donate today at ij.org/monthly.
What gave Leo the courage to step up and say, I want to put a stop to this? No one who is a lawful citizen of the United States and who's simply working an honest profession should be subject to this kind of random search and detainment.
Yeah. It's honestly very impressive because he said himself he's a timid guy. He's not very excitable, and it's one thing that I think has benefited him in these situations because he stayed very calm. He's not screaming or escalating. But he just feels so deeply that this is wrong, and he recognizes that while he is a victim, being a victim in this situation also gives him the power to do something about it. Mm-hmm. And he wants to use what happened to him to help other people. And basically what he says each time is just like, I want this to stop. This should stop. And he knows that because it happened to him, he can help make it stop.
Can you talk a bit about George Retes and what happened to him in California?
Yeah, George Retes is another IJ client. He is a U.S. citizen and an Iraq war veteran. And a few months ago, he was driving to work in Southern California, and he saw what looked like some sort of law enforcement operation that was blocking his route driving into his new job that he was trying to get to. And as he's trying to get in, he tells the officers there, I'm a citizen. I'm just trying to get to work. I have no idea what any of this is about. I just need to get in there because I have a job to do. They don't let him in. They give him kind of conflicting instructions about what he should do next. So he gets in his car and he's trying to leave. And rather than let him leave, the officers proceed to smash through his car door windows, pepper spray the entire inside of his car, and drag him out, violently arrest him. There was an officer kneeling on his neck at one point. So basically, the long story short is George was trying to get to work. Then he was trying to leave. and the officers proceeded to violently arrest him. They kept him in detention for 3 days. During the course of that time, he was not allowed to make a phone call to his family, a phone call to see a lawyer. They didn't let him wash the pepper spray out of his eyes. The next day, after a psych evaluation, he was put on suicide watch. And in the course of those 3 days, he also missed his daughter's 3rd birthday. So they eventually release him. No criminal charges, no explanation, no apology, certainly. George then goes on to talk about his experience and say, hey, look, I'm an American and this happened to me, and that means that this can happen to any of us. And unfortunately, DHS's response, despite the fact that this entire interaction was caught on video, was to completely just misrepresent what happened in response to George speaking out about it. So it's been a kind of harrowing and distressing experience for George. But as he puts it himself, he sees this latest effort to hold the government accountable for what it did to him as his latest way of serving his country. Previously he did it as a member of the armed forces, and now he sees a duty and a moral imperative, I think, to kind of speak out and speak up against what the federal government is doing across the country.
Jaba, you mentioned DHS's reaction to George speaking out. Could you go into a little bit more detail about, have they given some new explanation for what they did that tries to justify their behavior? I mean, what are they trying to say to get out of what sounds like a blatantly unconstitutional search and seizure?
Yeah, they put out what, frankly, has become their boilerplate response whenever an American or or a green card holder or someone else with status gets swept up in these violent raids. They basically accused him of being aggressive and violent. They accused him of assault. They accused him of obstruction. But there's a video. Right, and so it's hard to kind of square what amounts to a propaganda campaign against George when the videos bear out reality, right? And same thing happened with Leo, right? You have 2 different perspectives of video showing what happened to Leo. One, his first person perspective because he was recording, and another from other construction workers. It was those black and white construction workers that Jared mentioned earlier, who the officers did not approach at all before, during, or after this interaction, right? They were recording what happened to Leo too. And what you see in those recordings is Leo is a few dozen feet away from the encounter that he's recording. And yet DHS comes out and says Leo was targeted because he got in between officers and the person they were trying to arrest. Again, it's really hard to fight back against an agency that's willing to blatantly lie, frankly, in the face of video evidence showing what actually happened. So this is a pattern, sadly, that we're seeing of DHS when it is confronted with these truths of American citizens being detained, being assaulted by law enforcement officers, by masked law enforcement officers. They have this boilerplate response that they come out with. The video evidence shows otherwise. There's no then kind of follow-up retraction.
Sure.
They double down.
They double down, sadly.
Well, and there's no charges here, right? Like, if they thought that George was, assaulting anybody, if they thought that Leo was, obstructing this, otherwise law enforcement interaction, they would bring charges about that. Like, if they believed what they themselves were saying, there would be charges somewhere.
And instead, they let Leo go as soon as they confirmed his citizenship.
Sure.
And to Jaba's point, it's just like it's a little disorienting. I think the word propaganda gets used a lot anytime the government is sort of pushing a line, but this really is just putting forward a different version of reality for people to believe. One, the people who are already prone to believe that, but two, it makes it difficult to talk about these cases in the press because journalists it's so ingrained into them that if the government is saying something, it must be true. And here you are, some lawyer telling me that this happened, but the assistant secretary of the Department of Homeland Security is telling me that your client got between an officer who was trying to make an arrest. I'm like, well, okay, well, I'll send you the first person video that shows that they're lying. But it does just add this extra layer of there's a presumption of truth for them, even though they will just shamelessly lie again and again.
So how do these lawsuits work? As our listeners know, it's really difficult to sue the federal government and to sue federal agents. So sort of how are we doing these lawsuits?
How much time you got? Unfortunately, it is really difficult to hold the federal government and federal officials accountable for constitutional violations. Anybody who follows IJ's Project on Immunity and Accountability knows for the last 5 or 6 years, that's been a major part of it is breaking down those absolute immunity barriers that often get erected for federal accountability. But there is a statute, the Federal Tort Claims Act, which allows you to sue the federal government for these types of violations. That statute has many pitfalls, many exceptions written into it. It's imperfect, but we think it has a lot of value, and it is one of the mechanisms that we're using for both Leo and for George to seek accountability for what happened to them. At the same time, there are what we think there are avenues that for holding the individual officials accountable as well. Those, unfortunately, have been really narrowly construed in the last several years. We are trying to basically revive individual federal accountability. I will not bore you now with the various theories we have for how you do so, but we have them. We've been building them up for years, and we are ready to bring them to bear in these instances. But as we've been talking about a lot today, a lot of these federal officers are going masked, so it's hard to know who they are. They are not documenting the work that they're doing, like Jared was saying, before the fact or seemingly after the fact. So that makes it really hard to revive this individual accountability regime. So the reality is it's really hard, but IJ has been and continues to be fighting back against the elimination of federal accountability. And frankly, it's needed now more than ever.
So the Federal Tort Claims Act, we had a Supreme Court case about that earlier this year. Can you talk about that a little bit and how that relates to this case? We've done some videos about that situation, but just connect the dots a little.
Yeah, so the Federal Tort Claims Act basically says, like, rather than covering constitutional injuries, it gives you a list of torts, essentially. And if the government commits a tort against you, like anyone else.
What's a tort?
Good question.
Good question. It's basically like the assault, battery, trespass. If one of your neighbors had done something to you, whether they ran their car into your mailbox or you got in a fight over a fence and they pushed you and you were to file a lawsuit against them, you would be bringing a tort claim against them. Sure. And what the FTCA does is say, if the person who does that to you is an officer of the federal government, you can bring a tort suit against them, or really, you can bring it against the United States, and the United States will assume responsibility for what their agent has done.
That makes sense.
And then there's and it used to basically just not apply to law enforcement officers. There were these lawless raids going on in the 70s, I believe, and federal agents disguised as hippies and breaking into people's apartments looking for drugs and all sorts of lawlessness going on in Chicago. And so Congress put... Yeah, no, it does. And that's just on a quick tangent. That is why IJ is particularly well suited to take on the problems with the current administration, because we have been fighting these same battles over slightly different sets of facts for years now. And so we had this case in Martin, and it was about something called the discretionary function exception. And there are two provisions. One,
We don't have to get into all
Yeah, no,
that.
we don't have to get into the provisions,
yeah.
but one basically says you can only sue cops if they do these couple different things. So, like, the number of torts you can sue cops for is more limited than if it were a different person. But then there's this other thing called the discretionary function exception, which is incredibly, like, technical and tedious and boring, but it says if the government was carrying out a discretionary function, then you can't sue them under the FTCA. And the question then becomes, what's a discretionary function? And the courts have looked at that first word, discretion, and said, well, it's anything the government has discretion to do, which is effectively everything. And so we had this case, Martin versus the United States, at the Supreme Court last year, which was about a wrong house raid. The FBI in Atlanta, suburban Atlanta, went into the wrong house and raided completely innocent people's homes. And the lower court said, well, officers have discretion to choose how they prepare to find the house that they're looking at. And since they have discretion over how to find the house, like this guy used a faulty GPS apparently, but he threw it away, so we can't be sure. But because he had discretion to do that, apparently you can't then sue him under the FTCA. And so the Supreme Court cleared away a lot of brush in that case and sent it back to the 11th Circuit on the limited question of basically what's a discretionary function. And our position is, and we think it's completely consistent with the text and the history of the statute, is it's like the broad thing that an agency does. When Congress gives an agency the authority to make policy in a certain area, you can't then go into court and question the legitimacy of that policy because it hurt you. And the quintessential example, I think, there were cases about the FAA only doing spot checking of airplanes. And so not every airplane was getting a safety check done. And one that did not have a safety check done crashed, and somebody sued for a tort claim over that because they didn't check the plane. And what the Supreme Court said was, no one did anything wrong on that plane. They didn't do anything to harm you. You're just questioning the policy that they have, the allocation of resources to not check it in the first place. And so when you're challenging a government policy under the guise of a tort claim, you can't sue under the FTCA. And so our position is all of this stuff that law enforcement officers are doing in the field, whether they have discretion to stop someone or not, is not the type of discretion that exception to the FTCA is talking about. And so we have all of these cases, and we across the country now, and have been meeting with other groups to talk, like share our briefs and talk about our theories, so we can sort of fix the way that the lower courts have been thinking about this exception to make sure that all of these people whose rights are being violated in these raids have a right to relief.
To sort of wrap up, what is the big picture thing that we're trying to accomplish through these cases?
Trying to make the Fourth Amendment the powerful protection against dragnet law enforcement that it was designed to be. Like I said before, there's no immigration enforcement exception to the Constitution or to the Fourth Amendment. What you have is enforcement that's being done in this dragnet manner, and it needs to be done like any other police investigative work is supposed to be done. What you have instead is you have American citizens, green card holders, and other lawful residents being swept up by the hundreds. One thing I didn't mention before is that when people get arrested in these raids, the federal government then proceeds to take DNA swabs from them. So they're creating this kind of surveillance database, which contains, again, all of the citizens and other lawful residents who are being swept up in these raids.
Facial recognition scans.
Yeah. So the big picture point here is that the Constitution still matters, and you can't run roughshod over it when the enforcement of immigration laws and the enforcement of drug laws and the enforcement of XYZ laws.
Yeah. I think, the one thing I'd add is there was this case over the summer called Vasquez-Perdomo that made it up to the shadow docket of the Supreme Court. And Justice Kavanaugh issued this concurrence in saying there shouldn't be a stay. Basically, a judge in Los Angeles had said the government can't do racial profiling. Here they're considering 4 factors. It was like someone's job, their location, the color of their skin, and the language they spoke, basically. And Kavanaugh said, well, that's not just racial profiling, because that's like a composite of things that are all basically just synonyms for ethnicity. And we think that he had both a mistaken impression of what was happening on the ground and also just that it's an incorrect statement of Fourth Amendment law. And so one thing he emphasized in his opinion was that if this happens to a citizen, they will be let go promptly. And so he was under the impression that these stops are minimally intrusive, they're infrequent, the government's using some sort of investigative techniques and targeting. And I think what our cases show is that's not actually what's happening on the ground. And one thing that our cases can hopefully accomplish is by showing that, like Jaba said, citizens and people who have a right to be here are being swept up in this. And it's not just getting your ID scanned at the store. This is spending hours in handcuffs, getting taken off of your job site.
Or days in George Retes' case.
Yeah, being thrown to the ground. Leo had his phone thrown into the wet cement of the foundation of the house. Like, people they're missing work. They're having their property destroyed. They're having the windows of their car broken. They're having their car filled with pepper. This is a lot of damage being done to people, both their property, their dignity, their rights, and we don't think that was sort of captured in the emergency application that Justice Kavanaugh ruled on.
Well, thank you guys for coming in and talking with us today. And thanks to all of you for watching. If you'd like to get more of these videos, you can like or subscribe to our channel. And if you'd like to support this work, you can join us with just $5 a month at ij.org/monthly. Thank you.
Thanks again for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and tune in for more videos.